On a frost-heavy morning in November 1943, somewhere along the rail lines cutting through northern Italy's Veneto region, a German transport train carrying more than 400 Jewish and political dissidents was moving steadily toward the Brenner Pass and the concentration camps beyond. The train was maintaining its precise schedule, its locomotive pulling a string of sealed cattle cars through the fog, its cargo a mix of families torn from their homes and enemies of the Reich. But that train never reached its intended destination on time. It didn't derail because of partisan explosives. It didn't stop because of Allied airstrikes. It was quietly rerouted onto a slower mountain line because 6 Italian railway workers, armed with wrenches and intimate knowledge of every junction point in their territory, had altered a single track switch by a matter of centimeters in the pre-dawn darkness. This is the story they rarely tell about resistance. This is the story of how 6 ordinary men, fathers and husbands in work-worn caps and oil-stained overalls, became the ghosts in the machine of the Nazi deportation system. Most people don't know that some of the most effective acts of resistance during World War II were invisible. While partisan fighters engaged in armed combat and saboteurs destroyed bridges and supply depots, it was often the railway workers who moved unseen within the very infrastructure the Nazis depended on. They were too essential to be replaced, too skilled to be doubted, and too ordinary to be suspected. In occupied Italy by late 1943, the deportation system had become a ruthless machine. Following the German takeover in September 1943, after Italy's armistice with the Allies, the Nazis had seized control of the entire Italian rail network. Trains became the arteries of death. They carried prisoners to camps, troops to defensive positions, and stolen goods back to Germany. The Italian rail system was a complex network of junctions and mountain passes, and every switch point, every signal box, every route decision was a potential point of intervention. The Nazis knew this. They stationed armed guards at major terminals, conducted inspections, and maintained strict schedules. But they couldn't monitor every kilometer of track. They couldn't watch every remote junction in the foothills of the Alps. And that's where Luca Mancini worked. Luca was not a partisan fighter. He was not a political radical. He was a 45-year-old track foreman living near Verona, where the rail line split between routes heading north through the Brenner Pass and east toward Trieste. His hands bore the calluses of 27 years working on the rails. His father had worked these same tracks. His 2 sons, both in their 22s, had been conscripted into Mussolini's army and sent to fight in North Africa. He hadn't heard from them in 8 months. Luca's world had narrowed to his work crew, his aging mother, and the stretch of track his team maintained. He knew every bolt, every crossbeam, every signal box for 40 kilometers in either direction. He knew those rails. Every man on his crew knew them. They had maintained them for 2 decades of passenger service, freight transport, and now, increasingly, trains whose destinations no one spoke of, but everyone knew. Everyone heard the sounds coming from the sealed cars. Everyone saw the guards with their rifles. Now the trains carried something they could no longer ignore. In early November 1943, Luca Mancini made a discovery that would change everything. While performing routine track maintenance near a junction point south of Verona, he found something in the gravel beside the rails, a small bundle of papers, water-stained and torn, identity documents, a woman's photograph, a child's birth certificate, papers that had been thrown from a transport train by someone hoping to leave proof they had existed. Luca stood on that empty stretch of track, holding those documents in his oil-stained hands, and understood with terrible clarity what the trains passing through his territory were carrying. Not cargo, people, families, children. That evening he gathered 5 men from his crew in the railway maintenance shed. These were men he had worked alongside for years. Paolo Esposito, 39, who could dismantle and reassemble any signal mechanism blindfolded. Giuseppe Caruso, 42, whose father had been a socialist organizer and had disappeared after speaking against Mussolini in 1928. Antonio Benedetti, the youngest and strongest, who could shift a section of track with a pry bar when others needed machinery. Marco Lombardi, a quiet man with steady hands who kept the crew's route logs and manifests. Stefano Ricci, 38, who had studied engineering in Turin before the Depression forced him onto the track crews. Luca didn't make a speech. He showed them the papers. He told them what he had seen. And then he asked a simple question. We maintain these tracks. We know how the switches work, how the signals operate, how the routing system functions. If we can't stop what's happening, can we at least slow it down? The resistance network in the region had been shattered. In October, the Gestapo had rounded up dozens of suspected partisans in series of raids across Verona and the surrounding provinces. The organized cells that remained were under surveillance, their movements restricted, their ability to act severely limited. The 6 railway workers knew this. They also knew that their positions gave them something the partisans didn't have: legitimate access to the very machinery of deportation. What Luca was proposing was not sabotage in the traditional sense. It was something far more delicate and far more dangerous. They would use their technical knowledge to introduce tiny, nearly undetectable changes into the system. A switch point adjusted by mere centimeters, rerouting a transport onto a slower mountain line, a signal timing altered, creating unscheduled delays. A route manifest corrected to send a train through a mountain pass instead of the main valley line. Changes so subtle, the German transport officers would attribute them to the normal inefficiencies of a rail system under strain. The stakes were absolute. If they were discovered, execution would be immediate. But they also understood something else. They were already complicit. Every day they maintained the tracks that carried those trains. Every repair they made, every switch they aligned correctly, every signal they kept functioning was an act of cooperation with a system designed to destroy human beings. The question was not whether they bore responsibility. The question was what they would do with the access they had. None of them spoke of heroism. Giuseppe simply said, "My father taught me that when you see something wrong and you have the tools to fix it, you use them." Antonio nodded and picked up a wrench. "We know how to change a track alignment. Let's see if we can do it without anyone noticing." That night they began to plan. They studied the deportation schedules that passed through their section of track. They identified vulnerable junction points where a subtle redirection would send a train onto a longer, slower route. They calculated timing, measured distances, rehearsed the precise movements needed to alter a switch without leaving obvious signs of tampering. They were not soldiers. They were not revolutionaries. They were railway workers who had spent their lives understanding how systems worked. And now they would use that understanding to make the machine of death stutter and fail, one invisible adjustment at a time. Luca Mancini had been working on the Italian railways for 27 years, and he thought he knew every sound the tracks could make. The click of wheels over rail joints, the groan of steel under weight, the whistle echoing off the mountain walls. But on the morning of November 18th, 1943, he heard something different. He was kneeling beside the main line south of Verona, checking for loose spikes in the crosstees, when the transport train came through. It wasn't scheduled on any of the route sheets his crew had been given. The locomotive appeared around the bend, moving at steady speed, pulling a line of cattle cars. Not freight cars, cattle cars, the kind used for livestock. As the train passed, Luca heard voices, human voices, coming from inside the sealed cars. He stood up slowly, his wrench still in his hand, and watched the train disappear into the fog rolling down from the Alps. The sound stayed with him, not screaming. Worse than that, the sound of people calling out names, looking for family members in other cars, trying to stay connected through wooden walls. When the noise of the engine faded, Luca stood in the silence for a long moment. Then he saw them. Papers scattered in the gravel beside the rails. Someone had thrown them from the train. He walked over and picked up the first one, an identity card. The photograph showed a young woman with dark hair, smiling slightly. Her name was printed clearly, Sarah Levi, born 1921 in Milan. He picked up another, a child's birth certificate, then another, a marriage license, a university diploma, all of them bearing Jewish names, all of them thrown from that train by people who wanted to leave proof they had existed. He gathered the papers carefully and put them inside his work jacket. His hands were shaking. He knew, of course, everyone knew, the Jews were being arrested, that they were being sent away. But knowing in the abstract was different from holding these documents, different from hearing those voices, different from understanding that the tracks he maintained every day were being used to carry people to places they would never return from. That evening, Luca didn't go straight home. Instead, he went to the railway maintenance shed where his crew stored their tools. He arrived early and built a fire in the small iron stove they used on cold mornings. Then he waited. Paolo Esposito arrived first, as he always did. Then Giuseppe Caruso and Antonio Benedetti came together, talking about a broken signal box they'd repaired that afternoon. Marco Lombardi showed up carrying the day's paperwork. Finally, Stefano Ricci pushed through the door, shaking rain from his cap. The 6 men had worked together for years. They knew each other's families, shared meals, trusted each other with their lives when they worked on the high mountain sections where one mistake could be fatal. Luca knew he could trust them with this. He pulled the papers from his jacket and spread them on the workbench. He didn't explain where they came from. He didn't need to. The men gathered around, reading the names in the firelight. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Giuseppe broke the silence. His voice was quiet but steady. The train that came through this morning, headed north towards the Brenner Pass. Luca nodded. There'll be more. The Germans are using our rails for this now. Every route we maintain. Antonio picked up the child's birth certificate, studied it for a moment, then set it down carefully. We fix the tracks. We keep the switches working. We make sure the signals are clear. He paused. We're helping them do this. The words hung in the cold air of the shed. Marco, who usually kept the crew's records and rarely spoke during their conversations, looked up from the papers. So what do we do? Luca had been thinking about this question all day. We know these rails better than anyone. We know how the junctions work, where the switches are, which routes go where. The partisans can't move anymore. Too many arrests, too much surveillance. But we can move. We're supposed to be here. Stefano understood immediately. You're talking about redirecting trains. Small changes. A switch point adjusted, a route altered. Nothing obvious, nothing that would look like sabotage. Just enough to slow them down, send them on longer routes, create delays where people might have a chance. Paolo leaned against the workbench. If we're caught, they'll shoot us. They'll shoot our families. I know, Luca said. He looked at each man in turn. My father spent 2 years in prison for speaking against Mussolini. Before they took him, he told me that when you have the ability to help and you choose not to, you've made a choice anyway. One by one, the other men nodded. They didn't make dramatic promises. They didn't talk about heroism or sacrifice. They simply began to plan. Gathered around a workbench in a cold shed, using their knowledge of the rails to find the weak points in a system built for death. Outside, another train whistle echoed through the darkness.
The planning happened in fragments, stolen moments between their normal work, a conversation during lunch break, a whispered exchange while inspecting a signal box, a late meeting in the maintenance shed after the German supervisors had gone home for the night. Marco brought the key piece of information. As the crew's record keeper, he had access to all the route schedules that passed through the Verona district office. On November 22, he spread a stack of papers across the workbench. These are the new routing orders from the German Transport Command. They started coming in last week. The men studied the documents in silence. The schedules listed trains only by number and classification, no mention of passengers or cargo, but certain codes repeated. Transport trains heading north toward Austria, always at night, always on the fastest routes. Stefano traced a finger along the railway map they'd pinned to the shed wall. They're using the main valley line through Rovereto, straight shot to the Brenner Pass, 11 hours from here to Innsbruck if there are no delays. But there's an alternate route. Paulo pointed to a thinner line on the map, the old mountain track through Avio. It was built in 1910 for local freight, still functional, but it adds 6 hours to the journey. More curves, steeper grades. The locomotives have to run slower. Luca leaned closer, and there's a junction where the two lines split, 5 kilometers south of Rovereto, junction point 43. Giuseppe knew that junction. He'd maintained the switches there for 15 years. Manual control. The switch has to be thrown by hand from the signal box. The Germans haven't automated it because it's usually just for freight rerouting. Who operates it? Antonio asked. Right now, a German railway officer during the day, but at night it's usually empty. They trust the switches are set correctly for the scheduled routes. Stefano pulled out a notebook and began sketching. His engineering training showed in the precise lines he drew. The switch mechanism is a lever system. When it's set for the main line, the rails align straight. When it's thrown, they curve toward the mountain track. The adjustment is maybe 5 centimeters of movement at the junction point, but that 5 centimeters sends a train in a completely different direction. How long does it take to change? Luca asked. For someone who knows what they're doing, 2 minutes, maybe 3 if the mechanism is stiff. Marco checked his papers. The next transport is scheduled for November 27th, departure from Verona at 2200 hours. It should pass junction 43 around 2230 hours. The men absorbed this information. They were talking about their first attempt, 5 days away. Paulo raised the obvious question. If we switch the train to the mountain route, the Germans will notice eventually. They'll investigate. They'll look for who had access. Not if it looks like a mistake, Marco said quietly. He held up one of the routing orders. These documents pass through multiple offices. They're copied by hand, sometimes retyped. Errors happen. If the route sheet says mountain line instead of valley line, they'll assume it was a clerical error at the district office. Stefano nodded slowly. And if the switch at junction 43 is already set for the mountain route when the train arrives, the engineer follows the rails. He has no reason to question it. So we need to do 2 things, Luca said. Change the switch and change the paperwork. Over the next 4 days, they worked out every detail. Antonio and Giuseppe would handle the physical work at junction 43. They would go there after dark on November 27th, claiming they needed to perform emergency maintenance on a signal that had been reported as faulty. A plausible story. They performed night repairs regularly. Marco would alter the routing documents. He would create a new route sheet listing the mountain track, then slip it into the correct pile at the district office. He knew where the documents were kept. He'd been filing them for 3 years. The others would maintain their normal work schedules. They needed witnesses who could confirm they were nowhere near junction 43. They practiced the timing. Giuseppe walked through the motions of throwing the switch, counting the seconds. Antonio memorized the sound of an approaching train, learning to judge distance by the volume of the engine. The night before the attempt, they met one final time in the maintenance shed. No one spoke about the risk. They all understood it. Instead, they reviewed the plan once more. Each man confirmed his role. As they prepared to leave, Paulo paused at the door. What if this works? What if we actually pull this off? Luca looked at the railway map still pinned to the wall, at the thin line representing the mountain route. Then we do it again, and again, until we can't anymore. The next evening, Antonio and Giuseppe gathered their tools and headed into the darkness towards junction 43. The transport train would pass through in 4 hours. The waiting had ended. Now came the test. If you appreciate these untold stories, please like and subscribe. It helps us continue this work.
Giuseppe and Antonio reached junction 43 at 21:45 hours. The signal box stood dark and empty, exactly as they had hoped. They climbed the wooden steps and opened the door with the maintenance key all track workers carried. Inside, Antonio lit a small lantern while Giuseppe moved to the switch lever. It was a simple mechanism, designed decades ago when Italian railway workers built these mountain routes with their hands. A long iron bar connected to steel cables that ran underground to the track junction 30 meters away. When the lever pointed left, trains continued on the main valley line. When it pointed right, they curved onto the mountain track. Giuseppe wrapped both hands around the lever. It was currently set for the main line. He pulled. The lever resisted for a moment, then gave way with a metallic groan. He eased it to the right position and locked it in place with the safety pin. That was it. 5 centimeters of movement in the signal box. Out on the tracks, steel rails now guided approaching trains toward the mountain route instead of the valley. The entire operation had taken 90 seconds. Antonio checked his watch. Train should be here in 40 minutes. They settled in to wait, keeping the lantern dim. Giuseppe's hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from cold, from understanding what they'd just done. If the German transport officer had checked the switch settings earlier in the day, if someone noticed the discrepancy between the routing orders and the physical switch position, if anything went wrong, they would be executed before morning. At 22:28, they heard it. The distant sound of a locomotive approaching from the south. The sound grew louder. Giuseppe moved to the window and watched as the train's headlight appeared around the bend. A German Class 52 locomotive pulling a string of cattle cars. Even from this distance, he could see guards positioned on the platforms between cars. The train reached the junction. The wheels hit the curved section of track. For one terrible moment, Giuseppe thought he heard brakes engaging, thought the engineer had noticed something wrong, but the train kept moving, following the rails onto the mountain route. Within seconds, it had passed the junction and was heading up the grade into the foothills. Antonio let out a breath he'd been holding. It worked. They waited another 20 minutes, then reset the switch to its normal position. They filled out a maintenance report claiming they'd tightened loose bolts on the signal mechanism. Then they walked back to town through the darkness, not speaking, both of them wondering what they'd just set in motion. The next 3 days were agony. Luca, Paolo, Marco, and Stefano continued their normal work schedules, repairing tracks, checking signals, filing reports. Every time a German officer approached, every time someone mentioned the transport train, they expected exposure and arrest. Giuseppe and Antonio went to work each morning, performed their duties, returned home each evening. They couldn't ask questions about the train, couldn't show unusual interest, couldn't do anything that might draw attention. On the 3rd day, Marco came to the maintenance shed with a piece of paper. His face was carefully neutral, but his hands trembled slightly as he set the document on the workbench. It was a delay report from the German Transport Command. Train number 8847, scheduled arrival Innsbruck 0900 hours November 28th. Actual arrival 1520 hours November 28th. Reason for delay: routing error resulted in transport using secondary mountain track. Investigating clerical mistake at Verona District Office. 6 hours late. The transport had taken 6 hours longer than scheduled because of the mountain route. That evening, Paolo came to the shed with information he'd overheard from a partisan courier working in a Verona cafe. The train had been stopped for 3 hours on the mountain track because of a reported mechanical issue with the locomotive. During that stop, in a remote section of track with limited guards, 17 people had managed to escape into the forest. 17 people. Names they would never know, faces they would never see, but 17 people who were alive because a switch lever had been pulled 90 seconds in a signal box. The 6 men sat in the shed that night, absorbing what they had accomplished. No one celebrated. The weight of what they'd done felt too heavy for celebration. But Giuseppe spoke the thought they were all holding. There's another transport scheduled for December 3rd. Luca nodded slowly. They'd proven it was possible. They'd proven they could do this without being caught. The question now was whether they had the courage to do it again. Outside, a freight train passed on the main line, its wheels clicking steadily over the rails. The sound that had defined their entire working lives. The sound that now meant something different. Marco pulled out his notebook and began writing down the details they would need for the next operation.
By mid-December 1943, the 6 railway workers had successfully redirected 3 more transport trains.
Each operation followed the same careful pattern. Marco altered the routing documents. Giuseppe and Antonio changed the switches. The trains took longer routes. People escaped during the delays. But they were working blind. They had no way of knowing when the stops would happen, where the trains would be vulnerable, or whether anyone was actually getting away. They needed information. They needed coordination. They needed help. The answer came from an unexpected source. On December 19th, a priest named Domenico Russo appeared at the maintenance shed just after sunset. He was a thin man in his 50s who served at a small church in the mountain village of Avio, along the route the redirected trains now traveled. "I know what you're doing," he said quietly, looking at each man in turn. "And I know people who can help." Luca's first instinct was to deny everything, but Father Domenico raised a hand. 3 weeks ago, a train stopped near my village for mechanical repairs. 17 people escaped into the forest. 2 of them came to my church. They told me the train had been rerouted onto an unexpected track. They said it seemed like more than a coincidence. The men remained silent, weighing the risk. Finally, Giuseppe spoke. "What kind of help?" Father Domenico explained that he had connections with partisan groups operating in the mountain regions. These groups were small, scattered, and careful, but they were still active. If the railway workers could provide advance warning about when and where the trains would be delayed, the partisans could be ready. They could create distractions, cut communications, help people escape into safe hiding places. "You're creating the opportunity," he said, "but without coordination, most people don't know to take that opportunity. Let us help them understand when that opportunity comes." Over the next week, they built a system. Marco would identify upcoming transport trains from the German schedules. He would pass the information to Father Domenico through a series of carefully arranged contacts. The priest would alert the partisan cells. When the redirected train stopped on the mountain route, the partisans would be waiting nearby, ready to assist anyone who managed to escape the guards. The system wasn't perfect. They couldn't save everyone. The trains still carried guards, still had locked cars, still followed German security protocols. But the delays created windows, and windows created possibilities. They developed signals. If a train was redirected, Antonio would leave a chalk mark on a specific signal post along the route. Partisan scouts would check for the mark and know a transport was coming through. The partisans would position themselves at the steepest grades where trains had to slow down, where guards would be focused on the locomotive, where the forest grew close to the tracks. In January 1944, they redirected 5 trains. In February, 6 more. Each time, Father Domenico would send word back through his network about the results. 12 people escaped from one transport, 8 from another, 23 from a train that stopped for 4 hours due to a damaged coupling that may or may not have been loosened by partisan hands. Marco started keeping a record. He used a small leather-bound notebook that he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his home. Each successful escape was marked with a simple vertical line. No names, no details, just tally marks representing lives that had been given a chance. By March, the page contained 157 marks. By the end of April, 412. The number became something they couldn't stop thinking about. 412 people who might be alive because 6 railway workers knew how to throw a switch and a priest knew how to coordinate with the forest. But they also knew the number could have been higher. For every train they redirected, 3 or 4 others passed by unchanged because altering too many would expose the pattern. The mathematics haunted them. Marco's ledger showed the people they'd helped, but it didn't show the people on the trains they'd let pass, the trains they couldn't touch, the cattle cars they'd watched roll by because stopping them would have revealed the whole operation. One night in late April, Giuseppe stood at a junction watching a transport train head north on the main valley line. They'd made the decision not to redirect it. Too many trains rerouted in 1 week would raise questions.
This train would reach the camps on schedule. Everyone inside would arrive exactly as the Germans intended. He stood there long after the train disappeared, listening to the sound of the rails settling back into silence. When he finally returned to the shed, he found the others already there, all of them thinking the same thought. "We need to do more," Antonio said. But before they could discuss how to expand their operation, Marco brought news that changed everything. A new German officer had been assigned to investigate transportation inefficiencies in the northern Italian rail network, an SS Hauptsturmführer named Klaus Richter. The hunter had arrived, and he was looking for patterns.
The decision came down to numbers. Cold, brutal mathematics that none of them wanted to calculate, but all of them understood. On May 8, 1944, Marco brought the transport schedules to the maintenance shed. 3 trains were scheduled within 5 days. The first on May 10th, the second on May 12th, the third on May 14th, all carrying prisoners north to the camps. "We can't touch all 3, Marco said, spreading the papers on the workbench. His voice was flat, exhausted. Stefano studied the schedules. "So we choose one, maybe 2 if we space them carefully." "Which one?" Antonio asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. They had no way of knowing who was on which train, no way of knowing if one transport carried more people than another, or families, or anyone they might save. The trains were just numbers on German routing orders, but those numbers represented human beings whose fate would be decided by 6 railway workers in a cold shed, trying to calculate which act of mercy they could afford to calculate. Marco made the first decision. "Not May 10th, too soon after the last redirection. We do May 12th. "And May 14th? Giuseppe asked. Marco shook his head slowly. "We let it go. We have to. If we don't, Richter will see the pattern." No one argued. They all understood the logic, but understanding didn't make it bearable. They were condemning everyone on that May 14th train to protect their ability to help others later, trading lives they could see on a schedule for theoretical lives they might save in the future. The May 12 operation went smoothly. The train was redirected. Father Domenico's partisan contacts were ready. 28 people escaped during a 3-hour delay in the mountains. Marco added 28 new marks to his hidden ledger. On the evening of May 14th, Marco went to Junction 43 alone. He didn't tell the others he was going. He just took his tools and walked through the spring darkness to the signal box. He stood there for an hour, his hand on the switch lever, the one that could send the train onto the mountain route, the one that could give the people inside a chance. He knew exactly when the train would arrive. He had the routing documents. He could change them right now, throw the switch, save lives. But if he did, Richter would investigate. The pattern would become obvious. Their entire operation would collapse. No more redirections, no more escapes, no more chances for anyone. Marco stood with his hand on that lever while the mathematics played out in his mind. Save these people tonight and lose the ability to save anyone else, or let this train pass and preserve the operation for future transports. The arithmetic of conscience, a calculation no human being should have to make. At 22:15, he heard the train approaching. He kept his hand on the lever. The train's headlight appeared around the bend. He could hear voices from the cattle cars, not words, just the sound of human beings packed into darkness, unaware that someone was standing 50 meters away with the power to change their route, and doing nothing. Marco stood motionless as the train passed the junction on the main line and continued north towards Austria. He listened until the sound faded completely. Then he walked back to town, still carrying his unused tools. The next day, he didn't come to work. Luca went to his house and found him sitting at his kitchen table, staring at the wall. The hidden ledger lay open in front of him. 412 marks, all the lives they'd helped save. But Marco wasn't looking at those marks.
He was thinking about the train he'd let pass. "I stood there," Marco said quietly. "I could have thrown the switch. I chose not to." Luca sat down across from him. "We all made that choice, not just you." "No," Marco's voice broke. "You weren't standing there with your hand on the lever. I was. Those people passed right by me, and I did nothing. I made the calculation. I chose." The next evening, only 4 men showed up at the maintenance shed. Marco and Giuseppe were both missing. Paolo paced the small space, agitated. "This is falling apart. Marco won't talk to anyone. Giuseppe told his wife he can't do this anymore. We're losing people." "Maybe we should lose people," Antonio said. Everyone turned to look at him. "So what? We stop? Let all of them die because we can't handle the weight? 412 people are alive because we carried that weight. And how many are dead because we didn't? How many trains did we watch go past? How many times did we make Marco's choice?" The argument intensified. Voices rose. Years of tension and guilt poured out in that small shed. They were 6 ordinary men who had tried to fight a machine built for death, and the machine was grinding them down. Luca finally spoke, his voice cutting through the noise. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to Marco's house and Giuseppe's house, and I'm going to tell them the same thing I'm telling you now. We don't stop because it's hard. We don't stop because it hurts. We stop when we can't do it anymore, but we're not there yet." He looked at each man. 412 people. Remember that number. We didn't save everyone. We'll never save everyone, but we saved 412. And there's another transport scheduled for May 20th. So tomorrow we decide, do we keep going or do we let Richter win? The question remained unanswered that night, but the next morning 6 men showed up at the maintenance shed. Marco came last, his eyes hollow but his jaw set. He placed the ledger on the workbench. "May 20th, he said quietly. "Tell me the schedule." They were broken, but they weren't finished.
Hauptsturmführer Klaus Richter arrived in Verona on May 23, 1944, carrying a leather briefcase filled with transport records and a reputation for finding patterns that others missed. He was not the type of SS officer the railway workers had dealt with before. Most German supervisors cared only that trains moved and schedules were maintained. They shouted orders, demanded efficiency, but rarely questioned the details. Richter was different. He asked questions, he studied paperwork, he noticed things. Marco saw him first, standing in the district railway office examining route logs with a systematic precision that made Marco's blood run cold. He was tall and thin, wearing rimless glasses that caught the light as he moved his head from document to document. He made notes in a small book using a mechanical pencil. Every few minutes he would pause, consult a different set of papers, then make another note. That evening, Marco brought the news to the maintenance shed. "He's looking at delay reports, all of them, going back to November." "How many has he reviewed?" Luca asked. "I saw at least 40 files on his desk. He's organizing them by date, by route, by type of delay. He's building a timeline." Stefano understood immediately what that meant. If he maps all our redirections, he'll see they're concentrated in specific areas, Junction 43, the routes we control, the places we have access. "Does he suspect sabotage?" Giuseppe asked. "I don't know what he suspects, but he's looking for explanations, and he won't stop until he finds one." Over the next week, Richter's investigation intensified. He began interviewing railway personnel, German engineers who had driven the trains, Italian workers who maintained the tracks. He asked detailed questions about specific delays, which signals malfunctioned, which switches needed repair, who authorized the route changes. Paolo was questioned on May 27th. Richter sat across from him in the district office, papers spread across the desk between them. "You work on signal maintenance, correct, Hauptsturmführer?" "Yes, Hauptsturmführer." "Tell me about the signal repair at Junction 43 on November 27th, 1943. Paolo's heart hammered, but he kept his voice steady.
There was a report of a faulty signal. Giuseppe Caruso and I performed maintenance that night, tightened some connections, standard procedure. Richter consulted his notes. That same night, a transport train was rerouted onto the mountain track due to what was later determined to be a clerical error in the routing documents. Interesting coincidence. I wouldn't know about routing documents, sir. I only handle signal equipment. Richter watched him for a long moment, then made another note. Of course, thank you for your time. But the questions continued. Antonio was interviewed, then Stefano. Each time, Richter asked about specific dates, specific junctions, specific repairs. He was building connections, drawing lines between events that the railway workers had carefully kept separate. On June 6th, Richter did something that terrified them all. He began spending time at the maintenance shed, not questioning anyone, just observing. He would stand near the workbench where they kept their tools, watching them prepare for their daily assignments. He studied the railway maps on the wall. He asked casual questions about how they decided who worked which sections. The 6 men continued their normal routines, acutely aware of his presence. They couldn't meet to plan, couldn't discuss anything beyond ordinary railway business, couldn't even look at each other in ways that might suggest connection or conspiracy. Father Domenico sent word through his network that they should stop all operations immediately. The risk had become too great. But there was a transport scheduled for June 8th and another for June 11th. The workers faced an impossible decision: continue and likely expose themselves, or stop and abandon people they might still save. On June 6th, Luca was working near the rail yard when Richter approached him. The SS officer had his briefcase, but his manner seemed almost conversational. "You've worked on these railways a long time, yes?" Richter asked in careful Italian. 27 years, Hauptsturmführer. Then you understand systems. You understand how things should work when they're functioning properly. Richter opened his briefcase and pulled out a chart covered with marks and annotations. "Look at this. Transport delays in this region, November to May. Can you see the pattern?" Luca looked at the chart. Each redirect they'd performed was marked, the dates, the locations, the delays, and Richter had drawn lines connecting them. The pattern was obvious once you looked for it. Too obvious. "I see delays," Luca said carefully. "Railways have delays, especially during war. But these delays cluster around specific junctions, junctions maintained by specific work crews, your crew specifically." Luca met his gaze. "We maintain 15 kilometers of track. Of course, delays happen in areas we're responsible. That's why we're there, to fix problems." Richter studied him for a long moment, then closed his briefcase. "I'm sure that's true, but I will be watching very carefully from now on. If there are any more problems in your section, I will know exactly who to question. Do you understand?" "Yes, Hauptsturmführer." That evening, the 6 men met in Giuseppe's barn instead of the maintenance shed. They couldn't risk being seen together anywhere Richter might observe. "He knows," Marco said. "Maybe he can't prove it yet, but he knows." "The June 8th transport," Antonio said. "We have to let it go. We can't risk another redirection." But Giuseppe shook his head. "If we stop now, everyone on that train dies for nothing. Richter is already suspicious. Whether we redirect one more train or not won't change that, but it might save lives. Or it might get us all executed and end the operation forever," Stefano countered. They argued for hours. Finally, Luca made the decision. "One more. June 8th. We do it carefully, we do it perfectly, and then we stop. We've saved 412 people. If this works, maybe we save a few more. But after June 8th, we shut down completely." The decision was made, but as they left Giuseppe's barn and walked home through the darkness, each man understood the truth. They weren't just planning another redirection, they were planning their last one, and Richter would be watching.
The transport, scheduled for June 8, 1944, was different from any they'd seen before. Marco's hands shook when he brought the routing orders to Giuseppe's barn. Over 900 prisoners, the largest single transport to pass through their section since the German occupation began. "They're emptying detention centers ahead of the Allied advance," Marco explained. "Rome fell to the Allies on June 4th. The Germans are moving prisoners north before they can be liberated." Father Domenico's message arrived the next day through the partisan network. His contacts were ready for a coordinated effort. If the railway workers could redirect this transport onto the mountain route, partisan groups would stage their largest operation yet. They would create a diversion at a narrow pass where the train would be forced to slow. Multiple escape points, guides waiting to lead people into safe hiding places in the mountains. It was the most ambitious plan they'd ever attempted, and the most dangerous. The 6 men prepared with meticulous care. Giuseppe and Antonio would handle the switch at Junction 43, as they'd done so many times before. Marco had already altered the routing documents 2 days earlier, creating a paper trail that would appear to be a legitimate clerical correction. Luca, Paolo, and Stefano would maintain visible presence at other work sites, establishing alibis. But on the evening of June 8th, everything changed. Word came from a railway clerk at the Verona station. Hauptsturmführer Richter had boarded the transport train personally. He would be accompanying it all the way to the Austrian border. Giuseppe wanted to abort immediately. If Richter is on that train and notices the redirection, he'll stop everything. He'll investigate on the spot. He'll trace it directly back to us. 900 people, Antonio said quietly. If we don't redirect this train, all of them reach the camps. All of them. Luca made the decision. We proceed, but we change the plan. Giuseppe, you can't be at the junction. If Richter investigates tonight, he can't find you there. I'll throw the switch myself. You haven't done it before, Giuseppe protested. You don't know the mechanism. Then you have 2 hours to teach me. At Junction 43, Giuseppe walked Luca through every detail of the switch mechanism. The resistance point where the lever would stick, the exact angle needed for proper alignment, the sound the lock would make when it engaged correctly. They practiced twice with the lever, then reset it to normal position. If anything feels wrong, if the lever doesn't move smoothly, stop. A jammed switch is worse than no switch. The train could derail, Giuseppe said. Luca nodded. Get back to your family. Make sure you're visible at home tonight, all of you. After the others left, Luca waited in the darkness near the signal box. He could see the main rail line from here, stretching south towards Verona. At 22:10, he saw the train's headlight appear in the distance. He climbed to the signal box and put his hand on the switch lever. This was their last redirection. Everything they'd built over 7 months came down to this moment. 412 people already saved, maybe hundreds more tonight if this worked. The train grew closer. Luca could hear it now, the heavy chug of the locomotive pulling an enormous weight. He wrapped both hands around the lever and pulled. It moved smoothly, exactly as Giuseppe described. He guided it to the right position and secured the lock. The metallic click sounded clear in the night air. Done. But then, Luca heard something that froze his blood. Voices. German voices, coming from the direction of the tracks. He looked out the signal box window and saw 2 figures walking along the rail line with flashlights. One was a German railway engineer in uniform. The other was Hauptsturmführer Richter. They were inspecting the junction, right now, before the train arrived. Luca's mind raced. He couldn't leave the signal box without being seen. He couldn't change the switch back without them hearing it. He was trapped with the evidence of sabotage, locked in place 30 meters from an SS officer who had been hunting for exactly this proof. Richter and the engineer reached the junction point. Richter crouched down, examining the rails with his flashlight. "This is where the main line splits," he said in German. Luca understood to follow. "According to the routing order, we should continue straight on the valley line, correct?" The engineer nodded. "Yes, Hauptsturmführer, the valley route to the Brenner Pass." Richter stood and played his flashlight along the tracks. The beam moved closer to the switch point. If he looked carefully, he would see that the rails were aligned for the mountain route, not the valley line. He would know immediately that something was wrong.
Luca made a decision. He couldn't let Richter discover the switch before the train arrived. He had to create a distraction. He picked up a heavy wrench from the signal box tool rack, opened the door, and stepped out onto the platform. "Who's there?" Richter's flashlight swung towards him immediately. Luca raised the wrench, keeping it visible as a tool, not a weapon. "Railway maintenance, Luca Mancini. I'm performing a safety inspection of the signal equipment." Richter approached quickly, the engineer following. "At night? Why are you here?" "We received a report of a faulty signal indicator at this junction earlier today. I'm checking it before the evening transports come through. Safety protocol." It was a plausible lie. Maintenance workers did perform emergency repairs at all hours, but Richter's eyes were suspicious, calculating. "Show me your work authorization." Luca pulled the standard maintenance form from his pocket. Every railway worker carried them. Giuseppe had filled one out weeks ago as part of their preparation, though Luca had never expected to need it like this. Richter examined the form under his flashlight. Behind them, Luca could hear the transport train approaching, maybe 3 minutes away. If Richter kept questioning him for 3 more minutes, the train would hit the junction and follow the redirected rails before anyone could stop it. But then Richter handed back the form and turned to the engineer. "Check the switch alignment. Make sure it's set correctly for our route." The engineer walked towards the switch point, towards the lever that Luca had just thrown, towards the evidence that would destroy everything. Luca watched him approach, knowing that in seconds this would all be over. 7 months of secret resistance, 412 lives saved, and now 900 people who would reach the camps because Luca's last attempt had failed meters from success. The train's headlights swept around the curve. The engineer reached the switch point and crouched down to examine it, and the world seemed to hold its breath.
The German engineer stood at the switch point, his flashlight illuminating the rails. Luca watched from the signal box platform, every muscle in his body tense. Richter stood beside him, waiting for the engineer's report. Then the transport train's whistle pierced the night air. The engineer looked up, startled by how close it was. The locomotive was already approaching the junction, too close to stop, moving at full speed toward the switch point. "Hauptsturmfuhrer? The train!" the engineer started to call out. But his words were drowned by the roar of the locomotive hitting the junction. The massive wheels followed the rails exactly as they'd been set, not straight toward the valley route, but curving right onto the mountain track. Richter understood immediately. "No, that's the wrong route." He turned to the engineer. "Why is the switch set for the mountain line?" The engineer ran to the switch mechanism, examining it with his flashlight. "The lever is locked in position. This was set deliberately." Richter spun toward Luca. His hand moved to the pistol at his belt. You did this." Luca didn't run. There was nowhere to go. "I'm a railway worker. I follow the routing orders I receive." "The routing orders specify the valley route." Richter's voice was cold with fury. "This train is going to the camps. Every minute of delay—" He stopped himself, realizing what he'd just confirmed. But there was nothing he could do now. The train was already committed to the mountain route, its long line of cars following the locomotive around the curve. Stopping it would require communications equipment back at the station. By the time any message could be sent, the train would be deep into the mountain passes. Richter made his decision. "You're under arrest for sabotage. You will be held until we determine how many others are involved in this operation." He ordered the engineer to radio ahead from the signal box equipment, but the radio had been quietly disabled days ago by Paolo, standard maintenance procedure according to the work logs. Richter cursed and grabbed Luca by the arm. "You're coming with me. We'll sort this out at the station." But they never made it to the station. As they walked toward Richter's vehicle, partisan scouts who'd been watching the junction emerged from the darkness. 2 quick gunshots. The engineer fell. Richter dove behind a railway equipment shed, returning fire. In the chaos, Luca ran into the forest. Behind him, he heard Richter shouting orders into the night, but the partisans had already vanished into the trees. Luca ran until his lungs burned, until the lights of the junction disappeared behind him. He didn't stop until he reached a partisan safe house that Father Domenico had told him about months ago for emergencies exactly like this one. The priests arrived before dawn. "The train stopped in the mountain pass 3 hours ago," he said. "The partisans staged the diversion as planned. In the confusion, 273 people escaped into the mountains. We have guides leading them to safe locations." Luca sat with his head in his hands. "Richter knows. He'll identify all of us." "He already has," Father Domenico said quietly. "German soldiers raided Giuseppe's home 2 hours ago. Antonio's and Stefano's as well. They were arrested." The words hit Luca like a physical blow. "And the others?" "Paolo and Marco received warning. They're in hiding. But Giuseppe, Antonio, and Stefano—" The priest couldn't finish the sentence. For 3 days, Luca stayed in the safe house while Father Domenico brought news. The Germans had launched a massive investigation. They'd found Marco's hidden ledger during a search of his home, the 412 tally marks, the dates that corresponded with transport delays, evidence of everything they'd done. On June 12th, Giuseppe Caruso, Antonio Benedetti, and Stefano Ricci were executed by firing squad in the Verona train yard. The Germans posted notices throughout the region: saboteurs, traitors, enemies of the Reich. Their bodies were left on display as a warning. Luca learned the news from a partisan courier. He asked to be alone, then sat in the small room of the safe house trying to comprehend what had happened. 3 men he'd worked alongside for years. 3 men who'd become more than colleagues, more than friends. 3 men who'd made the same choice he had, to use their knowledge to fight a system built for death. Gone. Paolo and Marco were moved to different safe houses deep in the mountains. The 3 surviving members of the crew spent the final year of the war in hiding, passed from one partisan group to another, living under false names, never staying in one place longer than a few weeks. They never worked together again, never spoke about what they'd done. The weight of what they'd accomplished and what it had cost was too heavy to share, even with each other. Luca spent his time helping partisan groups with logistics, using his railway knowledge to identify German supply vulnerabilities. But the work felt hollow. Every day he thought about Giuseppe, Antonio, and Stefano. Every night he wondered if the 685 lives they'd saved, 412 from the earlier operations, 273 from that final night, had been worth the price 3 families had paid. The mathematics of conscience had no satisfying answer. It never did. In April 1945, the war ended. The Germans retreated. The Allied forces advanced through northern Italy. Luca, Paolo, and Marco emerged from hiding to find a country trying to rebuild itself from ruins. They returned to Verona separately, each man unsure what remained of their old lives. Giuseppe's widow refused to speak to Luca. She blamed him for her husband's death, and Luca couldn't argue with her. He blamed himself, too. The railway system needed workers. Italy was desperate to restore transportation infrastructure. Luca was offered his old position. He declined. He couldn't work on those tracks anymore. Couldn't stand at those junctions without seeing Giuseppe's face, hearing Antonio's laugh, remembering Stefano's steady hands on the signal equipment. Paolo took a job in a factory. Marco moved to a different region entirely, cutting ties with everything connected to those 7 months. The story of what they'd done remained hidden. The partisan networks knew pieces of it. Father Domenico knew the whole truth. But in the chaos of post-war Italy, with millions of stories of resistance and collaboration, heroism and survival, the tale of 6 railway workers who'd saved 685 lives by throwing switches in the darkness was just one more narrative that didn't fit neatly into anyone's version of history. Luca kept one thing from those months: a single page torn from Marco's ledger before the Germans seized it. 685 vertical marks. No names, no details. Just lines,
representing people who'd been given a chance. He looked at that page sometimes, late at night, and tried to calculate whether it had been worth it. But some arithmetic has no solution. Some questions have no answer that brings peace. All he knew was that 685 people had lived who might have died, and 3 men who deserved to live had died from making that possible. The weight of both those truths would stay with him for the rest of his life.
The historian was named Dr. Elena Rossetti, and she'd been searching for them for 3 years. She'd found references in old partisan records, mentions in Father Domenico's private journals discovered after his death in 1979, fragments of a story that didn't appear in any official resistance histories. In October 1987, she finally located all 3 survivors. Luca Mancini was 89 years old, living in a small apartment in Milan. Paolo Esposito, 82, lived with his daughter in Verona. Marco Lombardi, 86, had spent 40 decades in Tuscany but agreed to return for this meeting. They gathered in a modest conference room at the University of Verona. 43 years since the war ended. 43 years since they'd last been in the same room together. The 3 elderly men sat across from Dr. Rossetti, and the decades between hung in the air like smoke. "I want to tell your story," Dr. Rossetti said. She had documents spread before her. Partisan reports, German transport records, delay logs from 1943 and 1944 showing the pattern of redirections. "What you did was extraordinary. The resistance networks I've studied, the sabotage operations, the armed interventions, none of them achieved what you accomplished. 685 people. That's more than most partisan cells saved in their entire operations." "We weren't a resistance cell," Luca said. "We were railway workers who committed sabotage against the Nazi deportation system, who risked your lives repeatedly, who saved hundreds of people." Marco pulled something from his jacket pocket, the page torn from his ledger 43 years ago. He unfolded it carefully on the table. 685 marks, faded but still visible. "We kept count," Marco said. "Every person we knew had escaped, every life that might have been saved because of what we did. But this page doesn't show the complete story." "What's missing?" Dr. Rossetti asked. "The trains we didn't redirect," Paolo said. "The people we watched go past because stopping them would have exposed us. We made choices. We picked which lives to save and which to—" He couldn't finish. Luca leaned forward. "You want to call us heroes, write about us in your book about the resistance. But heroes are people who do things without counting the cost. We counted everything. Every train, every risk, every calculation about whether saving these people was worth losing our ability to save others later." "That doesn't make what you did less heroic," Dr. Rossetti said gently. "It makes you human." "3 of us died for this," Marco said. "Giuseppe Caruso, Antonio Benedetti, Stefano Ricci. They were executed because we threw switches in the darkness. Their families lost everything. Giuseppe's wife never forgave us. She died believing her husband died for nothing." "Did he die for nothing?" The 3 men sat in silence. It was the question they'd been asking themselves for 43 years. The question that had no answer they could live with comfortably. 685 people lived, Paolo finally said. "We know that. We have the numbers. But we don't know their names. We never met them. We never heard what happened to them after they escaped. For all we know, some of them were caught later anyway. Some might have died in the mountains. We saved them from one fate, but we couldn't protect them from everything that came after." Dr. Rossetti made notes,
But Luca could see she still didn't fully understand. She saw numbers, statistics, a story of successful resistance. She didn't see the weight of standing at a junction with your hand on a lever, choosing which train to redirect and which to let pass. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Dr. Rossetti recorded their testimonies, asked careful questions, treated their story with respect. But when she called them heroes one final time as they prepared to leave, Luca stopped her. "We were railway workers," he said again. "We knew how switches worked. We knew how to change routes. We had tools, and we used them. That's all. Don't make us into something we weren't." After the meeting, Marco returned to Tuscany and Paolo went home to his daughter. But Luca asked the university driver to take him somewhere specific, to Junction 43, 5 kilometers south of Rovereto. The junction was still there, though the old manual switch had been replaced decades ago with an automated system. The signal box where he'd thrown the lever that final night was gone, demolished in the 1960s during modernization. But the rails remained, steel lines cutting through the landscape, carrying freight and passengers north towards Austria. Luca stood at the junction point where the two routes split. He was an old man now, his hands shaking with age rather than fear, but he could still see it all. Giuseppe teaching him how to operate the switch, Antonio timing the approach of trains, Marco altering routing documents with meticulous care, Stefano drawing diagrams in his engineering notebook. A train approached from the south. A modern electric locomotive pulling passenger cars, nothing like the transports of 1944. Luca watched it reach the junction and continue smoothly onto the main valley line, passengers inside probably unaware they were passing through a place where men had once fought a quiet war against death. He knelt down, his old knees protesting, and placed his hand on the rail. He could feel the vibration of the train fading into the distance. The same steel, the same track bed, the same junction where everything happened. But the world had moved on. The trains carried different cargo now, different destinations, different purposes. Luca stayed there for a long time, his hand on the rail, feeling each train that passed. The steel was indifferent to history. It didn't remember the transports, didn't carry the weight of what had happened here. The rails simply guided whatever came along them, neutral and constant.
Maybe that was the lesson. The tracks didn't judge. They didn't calculate whether what had been done was right or wrong, worth it or wasteful. They just continued, season after season, carrying the present without memory of the past. But Luca remembered. He remembered all of it. And he would carry that weight until his hand let go of this rail for the final time. He stood slowly, his joints aching, and looked one last time at the junction, the place where 6 railway workers had tried to break the machine of death, using nothing but wrenches and knowledge and desperate courage. 685 marks in a hidden ledger, 3 executions, 3 survivors, carrying decades of questions with no comfortable answers. That was the arithmetic of their war. That was the price and the achievement, inseparable and eternal. Luca turned and walked away from the junction, leaving the rails behind. But the vibration stayed in his hand all the way home, a reminder that some things once felt can never be forgotten. The tracks still ran, the trains still passed, and somewhere in the world, perhaps, 685 people lived lives they might not have had if 6 railway workers hadn't known how to throw a switch. That would have to be enough. This story is a fictional narrative inspired by documented acts of railway resistance during World War II in occupied Italy and across Nazi-controlled Europe. The 6 characters, Luca Mancini, Paolo Esposito, Giuseppe Caruso, Antonio Benedetti, Marco Lombardi, and Stefano Ricci, are fictional creations, but their actions represent the real courage of railway workers who used their technical knowledge to resist the Nazi deportation system. Historical records confirm that Italian railway workers, along with their counterparts in France, Belgium, Poland, and other occupied nations, engaged in various forms of resistance, ranging from armed sabotage to subtle disruption of transport schedules. The Italian rail network was indeed used extensively for deportations following the German occupation in September 1943, and there are documented cases of railway personnel who delayed trains, altered routing documents, and provided intelligence to partisan networks. The technical details about manual railway switches, junction operations, and the vulnerability of the Nazi logistics system to small, precise interventions are drawn from historical railway engineering documentation and wartime transportation records. The geographical references to the Brenner Pass route, the Veneto region, and the rail lines connecting northern Italy to Austria reflect the actual infrastructure used during this period. While the specific operations described in this narrative are fictionalized, they honor the memory of countless railway workers across occupied Europe who understood that resistance could take many forms, not only through dramatic acts of sabotage, but through the quiet, dangerous work of using their technical expertise to save lives. Many of these individuals paid the ultimate price for their courage, and many others carried the weight of their impossible choices for the rest of their lives. This story acknowledges that heroism during wartime is rarely simple, that resistance often required painful calculations, and those who fought the machinery of genocide with the tools of their trade deserve to be remembered not as mythic figures, but as ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel. We're dedicated to bringing you untold stories of courage, resistance, and the complex human choices made during history's darkest moments. Every subscription helps us continue researching and sharing these important narratives that deserve to be remembered. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thank you for watching and for helping keep these memories alive.